February 2010, the McStay family home went completely silent. When investigators walked through the front door of the house in Fallbrook, California, they didn't find a crime scene. They found a house that was frozen in time. 2 small bowls of popcorn sat abandoned on the couch. A carton of raw eggs rested on the kitchen counter beside fruit that had already begun to rot. Inside the house, on a table, sat a pair of prescription glasses. They belonged to Summer McStay, the glasses she needed every single day. Outside in the backyard, the family's 2 dogs waited by their bowls, hungry and pacing the fence line, waiting for a family that wasn't coming home. Nothing in the house suggested a planned departure. Nothing about it looked like a family had packed up calmly, gathered their children, and chosen to leave their lives behind. But that is exactly what many people would come to believe. For years, much of the world believed Joseph, Summer, and their 2 young sons had voluntarily walked out of this home, abandoned their lives, and crossed into Mexico. The McStay case became one of the most discussed disappearances in modern true crime. A missing family, a silent house, a grainy border video, and a question that seemed impossible to answer. Why would an entire family vanish without a word? Joseph McStay was 40 years old. He was self-employed, ambitious, and deeply invested in the business he had built. He owned Earth-Inspired Products, a company that designed and installed custom indoor water features for homes and businesses. It was the kind of work that depended on presentation, where appearance mattered, where reliability is a must, and so is trust. His wife, Summer McStay, was 43. Friends and family described her as warm, creative, and devoted to her children. At the heart of the McStay home were Gianni and Joseph Jr. At just 4 and 3 years old, they were the boys around whom Summer and Joseph built their entire world. On the surface, the family was moving through something completely ordinary: busy schedules, work, children, home renovation, the familiar unfinished mess of daily life, where they seemed to be building a future that still felt active, unfinished, and in motion. Nothing about the family suggested that they were preparing to disappear. Their house was still being worked on, their routines were still ongoing, business contacts were still active, and no one close to them believed they were planning to abandon everything without warning. Joseph had a business that depended on communication, scheduling, and money moving in predictable ways. If he intended to walk away, he did not leave behind the kind of signs people usually leave when they are trying to vanish cleanly. And there was one more important part of Joseph's daily life: a man who moved close to his business, close to his schedule, and eventually close to the center of the case. Charles Merritt, known to everyone as Chase. Chase was more than a contractor. He worked closely with Joseph and had regular access to both the business and the home. He understood the family's routines. He knew when Joseph was working. He knew how money moved through the business. And he knew enough about the family's life to move through it without looking out of place. In 2010, Chase Merritt was part of the fabric of Joseph's daily life. He worked closely with him on the business and was familiar to the family. On February 4, 2010, Joseph McStay's phone records show the pattern of an ordinary day: business calls, personal calls, the usual rhythm of someone moving through work, family, and evening plans. At around 8:28 p.m., Joseph made a call to Chase Merritt. It lasted 1 minute. It was the last call he ever made. After that, everything stopped. No more outgoing calls, no more texts, no more routine digital movement. Summer's phone also went silent. So did their email accounts, their credit cards, and their bank activity. In the space of a single night, a family of 4 disappeared from the visible world. At first, that silence did not immediately trigger panic. People miss calls, families get busy. A day passes, then another. But silence becomes different when it begins to stack. Joseph missed appointments, calls went unanswered, family members became uneasy, and eventually, the kind of silence that can still be explained became the kind that could not. When the concern became serious enough, Joseph's brother, Mike McStay, went to the house himself. He climbed through an open back window to check on them. What he found was not chaos. It was something stranger. The dogs were outside, hungry and unattended. Inside, there were eggs still sitting on the counter and fruit beginning to rot. The couch still held bowls of popcorn. Summer's prescription glasses were still inside the home. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, no dramatic scene, no immediate evidence of panic. The house looked as though life had been interrupted mid-motion. That kind of scene can be deceptive because when there is no visible violence, people start looking for narratives that preserve normality. Maybe they had stepped out. Maybe something unexpected had come up. Maybe there was still an explanation that kept the world intact. Mike McStay knew something was wrong, so he called the San Diego Sheriff's Department. It was the first step in a search that would last years, but the first major lead wouldn't be found in the house. It would be found 70 miles south, right at the edge of the country. 4 days after the disappearance, the family's white Isuzu Trooper was found in a strip mall parking lot in San Isidro, California. San Isidro sits near one of the busiest border crossings between the United States and Mexico. And once the family vehicle was found there, the case began leaning toward a theory that would shape it for years. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from the border crossing, and in that footage, they saw what appeared to be a family of 4 crossing into Mexico on foot. A man, a woman, 2 small children. The image was grainy. The details were unclear. But once that footage entered the case, it did something powerful. It gave people a story. Maybe Joseph had chosen to leave. Maybe financial problems were bigger than anyone realized. Maybe there were private family issues no one knew about. Maybe the McStays had abandoned their lives and disappeared on purpose. There were other details that seemed to support it. Searches on the family computer related to Mexico, travel-related browsing history, a Spanish-language learning program. Taken alone, these details seemed suspicious. Taken together, they appeared to support a voluntary departure. But there is a difference between a theory that explains something and a theory people want to believe because it keeps the truth at a distance. The Mexico story did exactly that. It shifted the case away from the home, away from the family's immediate circle, away from the possibility that something violent had happened close to where they lived. And once that shift happened, the investigation lost years. For Joseph's relatives, the uncertainty became its own kind of punishment. If the family had left by choice, why leave without warning? Why leave the dogs? Why leave Summer's glasses? Why leave behind a house that looked paused instead of abandoned? The questions never disappeared, but the border footage gave the case a false center of gravity. And for a long time, that was enough. Even in the early days of the case, parts of the Mexico theory sat uneasily against the physical reality the McStays had left behind. Summer's glasses were still in the house. They were not decorative, they were necessary. The dogs were left behind, not arranged for, not handed off, just left in the backyard. Food had been left out. Household activity looked interrupted, not concluded. Nothing about the scene suggested a family calmly leaving for another country. And if Joseph truly meant to disappear, there were other problems. Businesses do not simply stop existing because someone walks away from them. Financial trails remain, loose ends remain, and so do the practical details of moving children out of one life and into another. The more closely the scene was considered, the less the voluntary disappearance theory felt like a coherent decision made by a family, and the more it felt like a narrative built out of fragments. But once a story hardens inside an investigation, it can take a long time to break it. While the world waited for the Earth to give up its secrets, the real clues were already hiding in plain sight in the bank accounts, and they lead directly to the man behind the mask. To understand what happened to the McStays, investigators eventually had to look past the image Chase Merritt presented to the world. He was in his early 50s. He worked in construction and contracting. He was personable, useful, and close enough to Joseph McStay to be treated as both a collaborator and a friend. That kind of closeness matters in homicide cases, not just emotionally, but practically. Trusted people often have the easiest access. They know routines, they know habits, they know when attention will not immediately turn toward them. And according to prosecutors, Chase Merritt had another pressure building beneath the surface: money. Investigators would come to believe that Merritt had been stealing from Joseph's business, not in one dramatic move, but gradually, through inflated invoices, false accounting, and money Joseph had started to question. Merritt also had a gambling problem, and gambling problems do not just create debt, they create urgency, they create pressure, and they create the kind of financial desperation that turns access into opportunity. Joseph, by most accounts, paid attention to records. He was not careless with business details. And investigators came to believe that in the weeks before February 4th, 2010, he had started realizing something was wrong. Whether Joseph directly confronted Merritt is not fully known, but prosecutors would later argue that the relationship had begun to fracture. And if that was true, then the person closest to Joseph's business may also have become the person most threatened by what Joseph was beginning to see. By the evening of February 4th, Chase Merritt had three things investigators could eventually point to clearly: motive, access, and familiarity with the family's home and routines. The McStays had no reason to believe the danger was that close. In November 2013, nearly 4 years after the McStay house went silent, the case changed. An off-road motorcyclist riding through the Mojave Desert near Victorville noticed what looked like human remains in the dirt. Investigators responded to the scene and uncovered 2 shallow graves. In one grave were the remains of Joseph McStay and his son, Joseph Jr. In the other were Summer McStay and Gianni. The family had not disappeared into Mexico. They had not started over. They had not abandoned their lives. For nearly 4 years, while the case remained suspended inside a false narrative, the McStays had been buried in the desert. Buried near the graves was a 3-pound sledgehammer. Autopsies showed all 4 victims had died from blunt force trauma. And suddenly the house in Fallbrook looked different. Not because the objects inside had changed, but because their meaning had. The abandoned food, the glasses, the dogs, the unfinished feeling of the evening. This had never looked like a planned escape. Now, investigators believed it was evidence that whatever happened had happened quickly. The case that had spent years drifting around the border finally snapped back toward California, back toward the family's real life, back toward the people who had been close enough to them to know exactly how vulnerable they were. The border story had not just been wrong, it had protected the truth long enough for it to harden. With the bodies found, investigators were no longer looking at a disappearance. They were looking at a quadruple homicide, and that changed the center of the case. They stopped asking where the family had gone and started asking who had benefited from them being gone. According to prosecutors, the answer began with money. In the final days before the family vanished, Joseph McStay had started to notice funds missing from his business. After the family disappeared, checks were written from Joseph's business account and made out to Chase Merritt. Investigators concluded those checks had been backdated and the signatures forged. That evidence mattered for two reasons. First, it gave prosecutors a clearer financial motive. Second, it suggested that the business did not simply drift into confusion after Joseph vanished. Someone was still trying to move money through it. Then, there was the cell phone evidence. Cell tower data placed Merritt in the Victorville area, around the same general stretch of desert where the family's graves were later found. Cell data is rarely cinematic. It does not arrive with certainty wrapped around it, but in court, it added another layer to the picture prosecutors were building. A trusted associate, a financial motive, questioned business records, forged checks, and movement near the burial site. Piece by piece, the case was no longer pointing toward a vanished family. It was pointing toward a man who had stood close enough to them to shape the story that came afterward. In November 2014, detectives arrested Charles Chase Merritt for 4 counts of first-degree murder. By then, the emotional shape of the case had changed completely. For years, Merritt had appeared to be one of the people caught in the family's disappearance. Someone grieving, someone waiting, someone who wanted answers. Now investigators were saying something far darker. The man who had stood near the family in public grief, the man who knew Joseph's work, his habits, and his household, was the man they believed had killed all 4 of them violently. That is one of the reasons the McStay case lingers. Not just because a family disappeared, not just because they were later found in shallow graves, but because the truth had not been hiding in some distant place. It had been near the case from the beginning, close enough to speak, close enough to grieve, close enough to help shape the wrong story while the real one stayed buried. The trial of Charles Merritt moved slowly. That is often the case in trials built on a large body of circumstantial and forensic evidence. They are rarely decided in one dramatic moment. Instead, they are built piece by piece, document by document, movement by movement, inference by inference. Prosecutors laid out their case through financial records, forged checks, gambling-related pressure, cell tower evidence, and the physical evidence recovered from the desert. They also emphasized the final phone call on the night of February 4, 2010, a 1-minute call between Joseph McStay and Chase Merritt, the last known call Joseph ever made. The defense challenged the prosecution's timeline and interpretation. They argued the case was circumstantial. They argued cell tower data was not exact. They argued someone else could have forged the checks. They argued Merritt had cared about the family. But by then, the prosecution was not asking the jury to believe in one isolated fact. It was asking them to look at the pattern, a trusted associate with financial pressure, a family that vanished in a way that did not match the public theory, business records that kept moving after Joseph was gone, physical evidence from the burial site, and digital evidence tying Merritt to the desert area. In long trials, juries are often asked to do one difficult thing: separate uncertainty from reasonable doubt. Because certainty is rare, but patterns can still be clear.
Therefore, the judgment and sentence of this court is hereby ordered, decreed, and adjudged that for the first-degree murder of Summer McStay and for the first-degree murder of Gianni McStay and the first-degree murder of Joseph McStay Jr., that the defendant, Charles Merritt, be sentenced to death.
In In June 2019, more than 9 years after the murders, Charles Merritt was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. For the McStay family, the conviction did not erase what had happened. It did not restore the years lost to the wrong theory. It did not undo the cruelty of how long the truth remained buried. But it did do one thing. It broke the lie that had survived for too long. What makes the McStay case so unsettling is not only the violence, it is the structure of the lie around it. A quiet home, an interrupted evening, a family the world was encouraged to imagine elsewhere, and a story that survived because it was easier, cleaner, and more comfortable than the truth. The McStays did not vanish into some unknown life. They were taken out of the one they had built. And for years, the details that should have challenged the story were forced to sit inside it. The glasses, the dogs, the food left out, the business records, the friend who stayed close. And in the end, the truth was not hidden by brilliance. It survived because the wrong story was easier to believe. The house in Fallbrook had told part of the story from the beginning. It took 9 years before anyone was willing to hear what it was saying.